Has someone ever tried to make you feel guilty for choosing yourself?
The clinking of glasses still echoes in my head, not because it was some beautiful sound marking the celebration of my brother's big promotion, but because every ring of crystal that night felt like a hammer driving into the coffin they had already built for me in their minds. We were seated at a long table in a private dining room, all polished wood, white linens, and the kind of dim lighting meant to make executives look like kings. My father sat at the head, as if the dinner were his accomplishment, and my mother hovered in her seat, smiling in that tight way she does when she wants to seem supportive without daring to break from my father's script. On the other side of the table, my brother Daniel leaned back in his chair, relaxed and smug in the way only someone who had been told since birth that the world was his could be. His tie was loose, his cufflinks caught the light, and he looked like the poster child for everything I wasn't. When the waiter poured the wine and my father lifted his glass, Daniel smirked in my direction. "Here's to climbing the ladder the right way," he said, his voice sharp enough to carry across the table, but casual enough to pretend it was a joke. He let out a laugh, that smooth Ivy League laugh that always made people think he was cleverer than he was. "And here's to my sister Emily, who still hasn't figured out that her only way out is to sell me her dying company. Don't worry, sis, I'll give you a fair price. Family discount." The table erupted in laughter. Executives chuckled, their wives smiled politely, and my father actually raised his glass higher, as if Daniel had just cracked the funniest joke in the world. He looked right at me and said, "Well said, son. To Daniel's future. To his vision. And yes, to the day Emily comes to her senses." He didn't even hesitate. He didn't even notice the way my jaw clenched. I didn't laugh, I didn't flinch, I didn't even bother to correct them. Instead, I looked down at my plate, cutting into the perfectly rare steak I no longer had an appetite for, and let the silence wrap around me like armor. I knew what they were expecting: anger, embarrassment, maybe a defensive speech about how my company wasn't failing, how I wasn't as pathetic as they liked to pretend, but I gave them nothing. My mother's hand twitched toward her glass, and for the smallest second her eyes darted to mine, as if she knew they had crossed a line, but just as quickly she looked away. That was her way, always quiet, always choosing the comfort of my father's approval over the discomfort of protecting me. It had been like that my whole life, and I stopped holding out for something different a long time ago. Daniel, of course, wasn't finished. He leaned forward, lowering his voice just enough to pretend it was between the two of us, though the entire table leaned in to catch every word. "Honestly, you should take it as a compliment. I wouldn't even think about buying half the junk startups out there, but yours? Well, at least you have a brand people still vaguely recognize. It'd make a nice little accessory for my new division." He grinned, and for a moment it was as if we were kids again, only this time the playground taunt had a corporate budget and an audience. I sipped my wine slowly, letting the bitterness sit on my tongue. Inside, something burned, not shame, not really anger either, but a kind of cold, sharpened focus I had learned to carry like a blade. They had no idea. Not a single one of them knew what had already been set in motion, what calls had been made, what papers had been signed. They thought they were mocking a woman too stubborn to admit she was losing, but in truth they were laughing in the face of someone who had already pulled the ground out from under them. I thought back to the countless nights I spent alone in my office, staring at spreadsheets while the world slept, wondering if I was insane to keep going. I thought of every bank rejection, every sneer from investors who thought a dropout woman with no degree and no pedigree couldn't possibly build something that mattered. I remember Daniel offering me help once before, standing in my office with the same smirk, telling me he'd take my company off my hands before it collapsed entirely. That night, I told him no with the kind of smile that gave nothing away, and I watched confusion flicker across his perfect face. He didn't know I had already started negotiating something bigger, something that would matter far more than a handout from my brother. The rest of the dinner blurred together, speeches about Daniel's leadership, pats on the back, a round of applause from men who thought they were gods because their bonuses were 6 figures. I sat through it all, nodding when expected, holding my tongue when I wanted to cut the air with 1,000 truths. Every minute that passed felt like a test of endurance, but I didn't mind. Every smirk, every laugh, Every insult was fuel, feeding the fire of what I already knew would come. As dessert was served and the plates of creme brulee landed in front of us, Daniel clinked his spoon against the glass and raised his eyebrows at me, as if to say, "Your turn, say something now." I only smiled faintly and shook my head. I gave them nothing, because the sweetest words I could offer were silence. By the time the dinner ended and we filtered out into the cool night air, Daniel had his arm around my father, both of them looking like kings surveying their kingdom. My mother kissed me on the cheek, whispering, "Don't let them get to you." It was too little, too late, and we both knew it. I walked away without a word, my heels clicking against the pavement, my silence louder than any speech I could have given. What none of them understood, what none of them even suspected, was that while they toasted Daniel's future and laughed at my expense, the ink was already dry. The deal had been finalized. By morning, their smirks would vanish and the empire they were celebrating would belong to me. I did not become the family disappointment overnight, although if you listen to the way my father retold our history at barbecues and golf dinners, you might think I leapt from a decent report card straight into a trench of bad decisions. But the truth moved slower and meaner than that, because it started with a scholarship that covered everything except the time I did not have while my mother was getting worse, and the bills were getting larger, and the days were stretching into a kind of rubbery fatigue that made every lecture hall feel like a luxury hotel lobby I had wandered into by mistake. I left during spring, not in a blaze, not with a slammed door or a dramatic speech, just with a quiet signature on a form and a nurse's schedule in my pocket, because someone had to take the calls, argue with insurance, chase down a specialist who answered emails at midnight, and keep the apartment from turning into a waiting room that never closed. When my mother stabilized and my father decided to call it a phase we would correct with discipline, I did not go back, because something stubborn and practical had hatched while I was juggling pill organizers and invoices. Something that whispered that if I was going to be exhausted anyway, I might as well be exhausted for something that belonged to me. The first office was a sublet behind a smoothie shop that smelled like bananas even in December, and the first hires were 2 interns who could code in 3 languages and still apologized when the printer jammed. And the first investors smiled warmly while explaining that a woman with no degree and the wrong last name for their donor lists should find a softer idea or a safer husband, which, translated into plain speech, meant take your big brain and wrap it in someone else's plan. I learned to pitch while holding my breath, to keep a ledger in my head when the bank account whistled with emptiness, and to make rent by selling small contracts nobody bragged about on LinkedIn, but everybody needed before a deadline ate them alive. And I learned to laugh in the hallway after a meeting where the managing partner addressed me as assistant, while I was wiping my own product roadmap off his whiteboard. I also learned that my brother, who wore his alumni ring like a passport stamp for every room that mattered, enjoyed calling to check in with the exact cadence of someone reading a polite obituary, and he would say things like, "You have grit, but grit is what people praise when they do not plan to fund you," and then he would pivot to the offer. The one he repeated every holiday like a hymn, where he would lift the weight from my shoulders by buying the company and letting me focus on what I am good at, which apparently was surviving. Somewhere between the second lease and the first lawsuit threat from a competitor who found us inconvenient, I stopped trying to convince my family that I was building anything beyond a temporary embarrassment, because their belief was not an ingredient I needed and their doubt, perversely, was a fuel I understood how to burn. I took meetings nobody knew about, not because I was hiding, but because I was learning that quiet is a tactic when loud rooms refuse to hear you, and I started building something that looked small from the outside and felt steel-boned from the inside. One contract at a time, with customers who were not glamorous, but were relentless, the kind of customers who do not purchase a brand story, they purchase a result. I watched my brother climb quickly through a firm that loved him for being fluent in their language, the one where heritage and polish and a certain unearned ease act like credit, and I kept my eyes on the math I could control. He made his first acquisition pitch in my office on a Thursday that smelled like coffee and ink, and he did it without malice, which almost made it worse, because pity dressed in kindness is still pity. And he told me I could keep a leadership title that meant less than an office plant, and I thanked him, smiling, because smiling costs nothing and reveals nothing. And then I walked him out and called a general counsel who owed me a favor from a project we had rescued the prior quarter, and I asked a simple question about a target I had been studying in the shadows of his firm's empire, a division that printed revenue and bled relevance, the kind of ship that looks majestic until you trace the rust behind the paint. That is when the clock began. Slow at first, measured in due diligence checklists and midnight calls and a non-disclosure stack that could choke a brave man, and then faster, with meetings in bland conference rooms where someone's assistant always forgot to order enough water, and faster still when the first partner on their side blinked at our growth charts and asked for a second look. My father heard a rumor just before Thanksgiving and called to ask whether I was in over my head again, and I said I was exactly where I needed to be, which he considered evasive, because anything that was not a confession sounded like attitude. And he warned me that family loyalty has limits, which made me laugh after I hung up, because I had recently learned that loyalty is just a word people use when their comfort might be inconvenienced. By winter, we had quiet options on two critical vendors that Daniel's division could not function without, and an employment offer drafted for a vice president who had been handed a glass ceiling coated in compliments, and a timeline constructed around their new fiscal cycle so that the right questions would land on the right desks while the right owners were skiing with their phones on silent. And if that sounds cold, it is only because you have not yet met the warmth of being underestimated. The small revenge I allowed myself before the promotion dinner was almost petty, and I will not pretend otherwise. I wrote a personal thank you note to an analyst who had treated me like a human being during negotiations. And I slipped into the envelope a single page that outlined a customer integration win we would gift to her if the board accepted our final terms. Not a bribe, not even a promise. Just a gentle nudge toward a reality where her good judgment was rewarded by a result that would make her look brilliant in rooms that had never pronounced her name correctly on the first try, and then I sat back and watched her memo thread the needle through men who were busy congratulating themselves. That night, while Daniel flattered donors and my father ordered wine like a senator, I scheduled the embargoed press release for morning and queued the onboarding packet to the new leadership inboxes we had set up under a quiet holding name. And as I closed my laptop, I added one final instruction tucked inside the welcome deck, a single slide with an innocuous title that would force a budget review on my brother's pet project the moment he logged in under old permissions, which meant that at dawn the system would ask him to request access from me. When I finally turned off the light in my office, the building was empty and the city sounded like a faraway machine exhaling, and I stood there for a long minute, not triumphant, not even relieved, just steady, like a runner with one more hill to climb. And I told myself that I could still walk away if it felt wrong in the morning, that I could still choose the soft version of the story where we held hands at brunch and pretended the world had not taught us who we were, and I knew I would not choose it, because the door had been closed on that version long ago and my hand was already on the next one, the one that would open with a push notification on every phone in their dining room. Which is why the last thing I did before sleep was set a silent alarm for the exact minute the wires landed and the embargo lifted, so that when my brother's name flashed across my screen at first light, I could answer with the calm of someone who has already won and say, very gently, that I would be happy to discuss his access request after our integration call. When people ask me later how I managed to sit through years of their smirks without exploding, I tell them that patience is a discipline nobody respects until it detonates, because my brother's grin had been sharpening since we were teenagers, perfected at every family gathering where he recited accomplishments like a toast while I was handed chores or advice disguised as pity, and I realized early that silence unsettles the arrogant more than shouting ever could. Daniel's smirk was not just an expression, it was a weapon polished by professors, partners, and a father who worshipped pedigree. The kind of look that said you are lucky to be in my orbit even as he dismissed everything I was building with the flick of his cufflink. He carried that expression into my office one summer afternoon, sat across from me as if he were negotiating a yard sale, and casually repeated the offer that had become a family tradition. Sell to me, let me clean up this mess. Walk away before you embarrass yourself. I remember tracing the rim of my coffee mug with one finger while he spoke, letting him mistake my silence for hesitation when in fact I was measuring every word he used like evidence in a trial, cataloging the rhythm of his arrogance so I could hear it crack later. He offered me a token salary, a ceremonial role that would vanish in 6 months, and a pat on the head disguised as partnership, and when he leaned back with that smirk, oh, that endless smirk, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was such a perfect snapshot of a man who thought the world would always bow to him. I told him no, simply and politely, because the deal I was chasing at the time required discretion, and his rejection letter had already been written in invisible ink. The truth was that I had been moving in silence for months, stitching together conversations with competitors who wanted blood but lacked the nerve to strike first, studying balance sheets until my eyes burned, and realizing that the very division my brother was being groomed to lead was bloated, vulnerable, and ripe for dismantling. They saw prestige, but I saw cracks, contracts that bled money, leadership gaps ignored under layers of champagne toasts, and a culture so high on itself that it never noticed the ground shifting beneath its shoes. While Daniel smirked across family dinners and assured my father that my stubbornness was temporary, I was quietly gathering keys to doors he did not even know existed. My father called me reckless one night, telling me over the phone that loyalty to family should outweigh ambition, that I should be grateful my brother even entertained taking my burden off my shoulders. And he reminded me of every dollar they had spent on my education, as if tuition receipts were shackles around my ankles. I listened, biting back the words I wanted to throw at him, because explaining strategy to men who believed bloodlines conferred genius would have been like pouring water into a locked safe, pointless and suffocating. Instead, I thanked him for his concern, hung up, and finalized another clause in the agreement that would shift ownership like a fault line. What Daniel and my father never understood was that failure had already toughened me in ways they could not imagine. Every month I stared at payroll wondering if we would make it. Every night I calculated debts against invoices, and every morning I walked into an office where survival depended on grit rather than legacy. My scars became my education, my losses became my professors, and in that crucible I learned to plan 3 steps ahead while smiling through rejection. So when Daniel smirked, I saw not a winner, but a man leaning on scaffolding built by others, never realizing the beams were rotting. The last time he tried to buy me out before the promotion dinner, he reached across the table, squeezed my hand like a benevolent prince, and told me he would make sure I landed softly. I smiled, nodding, even as I thought of the contracts already signed, the embargo already timed, the quiet army already positioned. I let him believe his smirk was victory, because nothing is sweeter than watching arrogance rip itself apart on the sharp edges of reality. And so, when I walked into that dinner, hearing his laughter bounce against the polished walls, I carried not anger but anticipation, because every insult, every joke, every clink of glass was fuel for the moment when the balance would shift. He thought I was cornered, that my silence meant surrender, but what he did not know was that my silence was the sound of the blade already pressed to the rope. The dinner carried on with the steady rhythm of self-congratulation, each new toast blending into the next, until the air felt thick with the smugness of men who believed they were immortal simply because they had not yet been humbled. I sat there with my fork poised, nodding at stories about mergers and promotions, about golf outings with chairmen and luncheons with senators, all the while reminding myself that silence is not weakness, but a tool, one that cuts sharper than any outburst. Across the table, Daniel leaned back in his chair as if the whole restaurant existed to frame his victory, his grin growing wider each time someone praised his so-called leadership, and every so often his eyes flicked toward me, searching for some sign of defeat, a crack in my composure that he could savor like dessert. I gave him nothing. My stillness was deliberate, my restraint carefully chosen, and though to them it looked like surrender, in truth it was the kind of quiet that comes just before a storm. My father held court with a glass of brandy, repeating a line he had used for years, that Daniel was the proof of his legacy, the polished product of his discipline and vision, while I was the cautionary tale of wasted potential. The daughter who squandered opportunity and refused to accept correction. He did not say it in those exact words that night, but every pause in his story and every chuckle from his guests carried that undertone, and I let it wash over me without reaction. I had learned that arguing with men who mistake volume for truth is like shouting into the wind. It exhausts you while leaving them more convinced than ever of their righteousness. Instead, I let them laugh, let them toast, let them believe I was too beaten down to defend myself. The truth was that I had already passed through the fire they kept threatening me with. I had already faced nights when the bank balance was down to numbers that made me sweat, already endured days when I had to look employees in the eye and promise we would survive without knowing if I was lying. Their smirks could not wound me deeper than those moments had, and the scars I carried had long since hardened into armor. So I sat in that room surrounded by wealth and arrogance and history, and I let them underestimate me one final time, because underestimation is the best disguise a fighter can wear. When the waiter cleared the plates and laid out the delicate desserts, Daniel tapped his spoon against the side of his dish as though he were the master of ceremonies, his voice warm with confidence as he asked if I had any words to add. Perhaps some congratulations, maybe even an admission that I had been wrong all along. The table leaned in with expectant smiles, hungry for the spectacle of my humiliation, eager to see the family drop out, bow her head, and concede that the golden sun had once again triumphed. I met his gaze, let the silence stretch long enough to make them shift uncomfortably, then gave him the smallest smile I could manage without revealing anything, and simply said, "I have nothing to add tonight." The disappointment on his face was brief but real, because he wanted the performance of my surrender, not the reality of my calm. As the evening drew to a close, the men shook hands and clapped shoulders, already plotting the next venture over cigars, while the women gathered their coats and whispered compliments about the decor. My father beamed as if he had hosted a coronation rather than a dinner, his pride spilling over in every gesture, and my mother drifted quietly at his side, careful as always not to disrupt the image he wanted to project. Daniel basked in it all, his arm around one of the senior partners, laughing with that infuriating ease that had always won him rooms. To anyone watching, I was the silent shadow at the edge of the celebration, the forgotten sister too tired or too broken to fight. But inside me there was a steady hum, low and constant, the sound of gears already turning, contracts already executed, and systems already shifting into place. I did not need to raise my voice, because the press releases were scheduled, the signatures sealed, and the moment of reckoning locked into the calendar. Every smile they cast at Daniel was one step closer to the shock that would ripple through those same mouths come morning. Every patronizing pat on my shoulder was another memory I would replay when the news broke and silence fell. When the valet brought the cars around and the night air hit my face, I breathed deeply, not for calm but for control, because I felt the weight of what was about to come and knew it would change more than just careers. Revenge is never clean, and victories, no matter how sweet, carry shadows of their own. Yet as I walked to my car, heels clicking against the pavement like a metronome, I knew there was no turning back. The choice had been made long before the dinner, long before the toasts, long before my father raised his glass to my brother and laughed in my face. The silence I carried out of that room was not defeat, it was the silence of a blade sheathed until the right moment, and by morning, when headlines and phone calls collided, their smirks would not only vanish, but collapse into something they had never felt before. Fear that the girl they dismissed had been holding the strings all along. At dawn my phone began its skittish dance across the nightstand like a trapped insect, and for a long second I watched it without touching it, letting the vibration hum through the wood while the embargo expired on a schedule I had memorized the way some people memorize hymns, because the exact minute mattered almost as much as the words themselves, and when the first alert pushed through, wire services, then financial blogs, then the more polished outlets with glossy pull quotes, I finally answered Daniel's call, not to savor his panic, though I would be lying if I said that part did not curl in my chest like a warming ember, but to control the shape of the day before anyone else tried to write it for me. He did not begin with hello or with any ironic jab. He went straight to the question, the one he must have believed could not possibly be real, asking whether the headline was a prank, some cruel rumor crafted by enemies of their firm, or a misunderstanding that would embarrass the journalists before noon, and I listened to the brittle edge of his breath while I pulled up the public statement and read it aloud so that he would hear, in my voice, the official cadence of a new reality. The acquisition terms were intentionally clean in public and satisfyingly specific in private, a combination of asset purchase and leadership consolidation that transferred control of his entire division into a holding entity we now owned outright, with transition windows that would look generous on paper and feel like handcuffs in practice, and I could tell the moment his eyes hit the line about reporting structures because he went quiet in a way I had never heard from him, the way men go. Quiet when they realize their name has slipped from the top line to the third paragraph. He asked who negotiated this, and how long it had been in motion, and what my endgame actually was, as if an endgame could be single and clean, and I told him the truth that fit in a sentence, that I wanted control of what I built and protection for the people who had built it with me, and that I had grown tired of watching him smirk his way into ownership of my story. He said this would destroy Thanksgiving, as if the holiday were the casualty that mattered, and I almost laughed, not unkindly, because he had not yet realized that the damage had been done long before the headline, back when he taught our father to measure me in inches of obedience. By 8, the messages from his partners had turned from condescension to clipped requests for clarity, the sort that confuse orders with questions, and our lawyers, who had slept in their suits, began their choreography of phrases like closing conditions and consent rights and personnel continuity, while my operations lead, who had never once asked for a parade, started moving teams into the new structure with the methodical calm of a nurse changing dressings after a long surgery. My father did not call immediately, which did not surprise me, because his temper always needed to be assembled first like a weapon from a case. But when he finally appeared on my screen, his voice carried that mix of disbelief and disappointment I had rationed my whole life, and he demanded to know whether I understood what I had done to the family name, which he pronounced as if it were a trademark I had defaced, and I told him that names are only as good as the people who carry them, and that I was done wearing mine like a permission slip to be stepped on. He said I had chosen war over loyalty, and I replied that loyalty that requires erasing yourself is not loyalty, it is theater, and I was finished being cast as the extra in a production that ran forever without changing. Around noon, after 2 town halls and a round of media answers that I kept measured and boring, because calm is what convinces the markets and rattles the arrogant, I walked into the newly assigned floor where his division's leadership had gathered under neutral fluorescent lights, and I introduced myself the way I always do, without chest beating and without apology. And I laid out the integration plan in sentences that valued the work rather than the lore, and while I spoke I watched faces shift from defensiveness to curiosity, then from curiosity to a very human relief that someone in charge had a map that acknowledged the messy terrain rather than pretending it was a golf course. Daniel did not attend that meeting, which was wise, but he did send a message afterward asking if we could talk privately, man to woman rather than winner to loser, and I told him he could stop by my office at a time that suited him, which I meant sincerely, because victories taste better without gloating poured over them like cheap syrup. He arrived with his shoulders squared and his mouth set in a line I recognized from childhood, the face he wore when he believed the adults were wrong and he was about to fix it, and he asked me whether this was punishment or proof, whether I had needed to break him to feel whole, or whether I had simply decided that the only way to survive this family was to outrun it in public, and for the first time that day I did not have a ready line. I told him I had wanted respect and room, that I had asked for both in smaller ways for years and been denied, and that the acquisition was not a knife slipped between his ribs, but a boundary built high enough that I could finally breathe. And he laughed without humor and said that boundaries erected with lawyers feel like guillotines to the person who believed the yard was his. I said the yard had always been our parents' and that he had been the favored tenant, and he looked down then, and for a heartbeat I saw the boy who wanted to be loved for more than his grades, and I felt a pang I had not budgeted for. We sat in a quiet that was not hostile, just unfamiliar, and then he asked if there was a place for him in the new structure, not as a prince reclaimed, but as a professional who knows his sector. And I said there might be if he could work without the smirk, and if he could accept that his email now asked me for permissions I would not grant lightly, and he said he could learn, which was both a promise and a dare. When he left, I stared at the skyline that had so often felt like a scoreboard and tried to decide whether I had finally won or simply changed the game, and it struck me that revenge, even the clever kind you serve cool and clean, does not so shut the torn parts. It only stops the bleeding long enough to choose what kind of scar you want. That night I silenced my phone, not because I feared the calls, but because I wanted to hear the sound of a house that did not argue with me, and in that soft emptiness I let one question climb onto the couch beside me and stay, the kind that does not demand an answer yet refuses to leave, whether power without belonging is just another form of exile, and whether the quiet I had fought to claim would, in time, feel like peace or like the loneliest victory I would ever hold.